So let's pick out some of the key words and phrases here and try and unpick them. We might be able to get a bit of a clearer handle on the poem and its links to Hardy's poem. If we just flick back here onto the, get rid of that, ask later. We just flick back. Where are you? No, where's it gone? Hang on. There we are. We just flick back here to the convergence of the twain. Look at the style of the language. It's very formal. Hardy's poetry, less so his prose writing, his novel writing was more contemporary, particularly linking to this kind of Victorian period that Hardy was coming out of at the end of the 19th and beginning of the 20th century. Much of his poetry is very formal, and you can see that here. You can see the steel chambers late to the pyres of her salamandrine fires, cold currents thrid and turn to rhythmic tidal lyres. Probably not everyone's cup of tea nowadays. It's very arch, very formal, and I think Armitage is kind of doing a similar thing in Convergence of the Twain. His poem, An Architecture of Air, free sky unlimited and sheer, smoke's dark bruise exposing the wound. So we do have that opening, which has that kind of sense of clear poetry, which differs from some of his other poems. We've looked an awful lot at his kind of very colloquial style of poetry, the kind of almost confessional style in some of his poems. But here we get a much more formal structure. Again, the structure is exactly the same. Have a look again at that. With the numbered stanzas, what we call a triplet or a triolet of 3 lines, and I think probably the rhyme scheme, although again he uses those half rhymes, very similar, with the rhyming at the end of each line in the stanza. Again, it's half rhymes: air, cleared, sheer. There's the air, the ear, and the ear there. There's a link in the sounds of those 3 words. So he's using that formal structure that Hardy used in his version, Convergence of the Twain. And so Armitage is, deliberately borrowing on the form of Hardy's poetry, and rather than the iceberg, he's linked it to the 2 aeroplanes flying into the Twin Towers. So we start in that very poetic way, and then we move into more familiar Armitage territory. Rescuers prod and pick, shout into tangled holes, landlines are down, mobile phones are false. Apple Mac still quotes the Dow Jones. A lot of this is again fairly mundane, and he's almost contrasting that kind of poetic language with the more mundane language of what happens after the event. Again, as I said in a previous podcast, jury is out a bit for me in this. I find it a difficult event for anyone really to have written about. Novelists have written about it, poets have written about it, and I'm yet to have read anything other than a slightly glib and overblown account of the Twin Towers. It's one of those events that's been so burned into our consciousness that any form of writing, it's going to struggle to come close to describing really what it was like. I think Armitage gives it a good stab here, but for me it's not the most effective of his poetry. For me, he writes the most effectively about individuals caught up, frustrated, anxious, disturbed, deluded, all of those things. And what Armitage has done here is he's turned his gaze and his focus on a huge event, a massive event, a life world-changing event, and as a result, for me, ties himself up in knots. That's not to say there aren't some saving graces to this poem, and I think he does give it a good go, but certainly for me not one of my favourites.